Good evening, City Council. I'm Kathleen Mallory, Planning and Sustainability Manager, and I'm joined this evening by Heather Davis with RHINA Consultants, who will be providing part of this presentation. I'm also joined by Amy Sinsheimer with PlaceWorks, who's our housing element consultant. I'm also joined this evening by Emilio Ramirez, who will be providing information should Council have questions. This evening, the City Council is being asked to approve the final housing element, inclusive of errata number 1, which is amendments recommended by staff to the final housing element. Council is also being asked to approve the associated environmental document for the housing element and adopt 5 ordinances to implement the programs and policies outlined within the final housing element. In order for the city to be on an 8-year planning cycle and be able to utilize ongoing and projected new housing-related funding, Council approval of the final housing element and submission of this document to the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD, is required by October 15th. Council approval of the ordinances to implement the programs and policies in the housing element must also occur by October 15th in order for the city to be able to retain discretionary review authority over projects on the new housing sites. Since committee and city council review of the draft housing element in April this year, there have been a few changes made to the housing element. These changes are in response to conversations with property owners, housing advocates, and HCD. These changes principally involved the addition and removal of housing sites identified in Supplement 1 of the final housing element, reduction in the number of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, utilized for lower income housing, from council authorization of up to 1,000 ADUs down to 490 ADUs in response to input from HCD. Lastly, refinement of program language in response to HCD input and housing element program additions due to city council and committee direction, as well as housing advocate input. SCAG, or the Southern California Association of Governments, established the city's total regional housing needs assessment, or RHINA, at 8,549 units. This allocation is the projected and directed number of units the city should accommodate and support construction of from the years 2021 through 2029. You'll notice on this spreadsheet that we identified on the left-hand column 8,542 units. This is because since the beginning of the reporting period, which is July 1st of this year, the city has received credit for the construction of 5 lower income units and 2 above moderate income units. As the table indicates, the city has a surplus of units in all of the income categories. This is consistent with HCD guidelines to create a buffer in the event that a site is lost. Table 3 in the final housing element was updated based upon comments from HCD and property owner interest. The table shows site capacity that's available. The largest change to this table is in the city's projected 8-year housing inventory is a reduction in the number of accessory dwelling units, known as ADUs, utilized to help the city fulfill its lower income RHINA. The table also identifies units to be constructed in specific plan areas and identification of units to be constructed on vacant and non-vacant sites throughout the next 8 years. The column on the right shows surplus of projected dwelling units to meet the RHINA The table identifies that through the site inventory process, the city will have a surplus in the very low income category of 439 units, lower income units, and a surplus of 98 moderate income units, and a surplus of 117 above moderate income units. This will provide the city with flexibility in approving projects and will ensure that the city can meet the RHINA over the next 8-year cycle. In other words, moving forward, the city does have enough land and site capacity to meet the RHINA over the next 8 years. Over the past 2 years, we've had a number of community meetings and public input engagement. As a result of this, we've received input from property owners regarding inclusion of their property in the housing element. Some have expressed concerns and they wanted their property removed from the housing element. 4 sites were removed due to those conversations and interest survey or requests from those property owners. Within the final housing element before you this evening, those 4 sites were removed. In addition, 7 sites were added, and those can be seen in Supplement 1. That was due to owner interest, and additionally, we corrected a few typographical errors in the document, meaning there was reference to parcels you see identified here in one portion of the housing element that did not necessarily show up within Supplement 1. The final housing element was presented to the Planning Commission 2 times. On September 2nd, the Commission reviewed the final housing element, including general plan element amendments, land use map changes, and draft city code modifications. We also summarized for the Planning Commission input that we had received on the final housing element. On September 16th, we reviewed in more detail the proposed ordinances to implement the housing element, including changes to ordinances in response to public comments that we received on drafts that were presented in early September. We also responded to questions from the Commission and the public at this meeting, and I wanted to detail out our responses to some of those questions in the event that they may come up this evening. First, there were questions regarding design requirements contained in the additive zone. There was a comment that asked why certain requirements were being imposed. Our response to that is the design standards in the ordinance are modeled after details contained in the Downtown Development Code, Common Development and Design Practices, as well as implementation of departmental design guidelines and requirements. Second, there was questions about adding new sites. Members of the public either sent emails or participated in the September 16th Planning Commission hearing asking for their parcel to be added. Our response to that is that sites are selected based upon a deliberate and targeted inventory and in response to HCD's site inventory guidelines. Specifically, all sites were also evaluated in the housing element environmental document, and the city does not need to add new sites, meaning the city has identified sufficient sites and developed ordinances to facilitate the corresponding inventory unit count. So there's really no value at this point in adding new sites now. We will, however, keep this information as part of our no net loss program, which you can read about in program 3 in the housing element, meaning if a site is lost that we previously identified as an affordable housing site, and the city dips into that surplus that I mentioned a moment ago, and if additional sites are needed because we've dipped into that surplus, we can potentially rely upon these additional housing sites that are identified by property owners that are not contained in Supplement 1, provided those sites meet the HCD site inventory criteria. There is also no restriction on the property owner securing their own general plan and zoning map amendments to support construction of affordable housing on their site. We also received a third question regarding why did we recommend 36 months instead of our typical 24 months for AHD, Affordable Housing Discretionary, and AHP projects when they're providing a 20% affordable housing on the property. This recommendation for 36 months is based upon the fact that cobbling together money for affordable housing projects takes time, is difficult, and in many instances may take longer than typical housing developments. Finally, we received a question about how the recommended 20% affordability works with the additive zone ordinance. The public asked how much of the required 20% affordable lower income units would be restricted for very low and extremely low income households. The draft affordable housing additive zone includes a requirement that all residential developments built pursuant to that ordinance are subject to the City of Oxnard's inclusionary housing ordinance. The inclusionary housing ordinance requires that new rental projects include 5% very low income units. The council may consider changes to this percentage when updating the inclusionary housing ordinance. And as mentioned, Program 10 within the housing element speaks to the timeframes for updating the inclusionary ordinance. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. The commission did vote on a 6-0 vote with one commissioner absent to recommend the package that we're bringing forward this evening for city council approval. I wanted to summarize briefly some of the changes to the programs that you see this evening. So Program 3 clarified timing to meet state ordinance update requirements. And then we made further changes to add the no net loss provision to Program 3. And you can see that in errata number 1. What that means is that when I mention that we have final program language in the final housing element, in some instances you'll use the final housing element combined with the errata to see the totality of changes to specific programs. Another change since the draft was presented to committee and council in April and this final before you this evening is Program 5, which is the parcel assemblage lot merger program. We added language to waive fees on targeted sites, and those are sites identified within Supplement 1 of the final housing element. We added that language to be consistent with City Council Ordinance 2927. Program 3 pertains to zoning code amendments. We clarified the timing for completion of various ordinances, updates to those ordinances pursuant to HCD input and departmental work plans. Program 9, Farm Worker Housing Program. We committed to creating brochures and continued engaging with that important stakeholder group. And this edit was also in response to discussions with housing advocates. Updates to Program 10, as I mentioned a moment ago, we changed timing to update the city's inclusionary housing ordinance from the end of fiscal year 2022, 2023, or by June 30th, 2023 to early 2023. That is reflected in an errata, and that change was specifically as a result of discussions with a particular housing advocate. Program 19, affirmatively furthering fair housing. There were substantial additions to this program, and they were added as a result of HCD AFFH guidance, which came out in May after we released the draft housing element. That AFF guidance was also identified, and their recommended changes was also recommended in HCD's finding letter on the draft housing element. Those edits that you see in the final housing element to Program 19, were presented to the City Community Services, Public Safety, and Housing and Development Committee in July of this year. Other edits to one particular portion of the AFFH program was added, and it can be seen in errata number 1. We added some additional language to respond to a particular housing advocate. Continuing on the other program changes between the draft and final. Program 37 is an accessory dwelling unit monitoring program. With the city's significant reduction in, in the number of ADUs utilized to fulfill the city's lower income RHINA, program language was revised in Program 37 to significantly scale back the intensive outreach and evaluation of program sufficiency every 2 years. Quite frankly, the language in Program 37 we don't need in light of the success of our ADU program. The language was put in there particularly to support up to 1,000 ADUs being utilized to fulfill the city's lower income RHINA. With the reduction in that number to 490, the intensive ADU monitoring and outreach program is not needed. Monitoring will occur as part of the city's annual report and annual housing element workshop. Program 41, Farm Worker Housing Study. Changes are identified in errata number 1, and the only change is to align the timing to complete that study to match what the timing is per the County of Ventura. The County of Ventura is the lead on the farm worker housing study. So instead of just saying sometime in fiscal year 2024, we provided a definitive time that the study would be completed, which is by December of 2024, to match what the County of Ventura housing element stipulates. Revision to Program 42, collaboration with the Ventura County Housing Trust Fund. In this program, we clarified that the city's collaboration with the Housing Trust Fund, Ventura County, our participation qualifies as funding in addition to securing alternative funding sources. Finally, Program 44 is a brand new program that wasn't in the draft, but it was presented to the committee on July 27th of this year. And this is a funding, an ADU accelerator program to help fund and accelerate the production of ADUs. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Heather Davis, who will be covering the next few slides. Heather?
Thank you, Kathleen, and good evening, Council. In the next few slides, I'll discuss the amendments to the general plan land use element and zoning text and map changes that must be processed concurrent with the 6th cycle housing element so that the appropriate zones are in place to accommodate development on the sites identified in Supplement 1 of the housing element that address the city's lower income RHINA allocation. These sites must accommodate at least 30 dwelling units per acre, which is the default density defined by the state for jurisdictions in metropolitan counties. This density is intended to accommodate the economies of scale needed to produce affordable housing. To make this happen, the city will need to amend the general plan land use element text to allow the default density in 2 land use designations, commercial and business research park, and amend the land use map for 13 parcels. The city will also need to rezone approximately 110 parcels, predominantly by adding an affordable housing overlay or additive zone on top of existing zoning that will allow the development of 30 dwelling units per acre. And to accommodate this, the city will also need to amend a few sections of the Oxnard City Code and create 2 new sections, which I'll discuss further in the following slides. Next slide, please. Most of the sites in Supplement 1 of the housing element are presently designated either General Commercial or Business Research Park, otherwise BRP. Presently, these two land use designations either don't allow multifamily residential development in the case of the BRP, or allow only 18 dwelling units per acre. These two general plan land uses would be amended to allow 30 dwelling units per acre on parcels that are identified with affordable housing additive zones of either AHP or AHD, which I'll discuss further in a future slide. Next slide, please. The land use designation on 13 parcels, which make up 4 housing element sites, would be amended from limited manufacturing or public, semi-public to general commercial or business research park to be more compatible with multifamily residential land use. This map, which can be viewed on the city's GIS link, shows the zoning changes and general plan land. The sites in the upper right corner are 2 vacant parcels adjacent to St. John's Hospital, which would be designated Business Research Park, consistent with their existing zoning. The 3 sites, or 11 parcels, in the lower left corner are near the downtown and the Oxnard Transit Center, and would change land use designations from limited manufacturing to general commercial. These 3 sites would have a similar zone change from ML to C2. Next slide, please. To comply with new state laws regarding default density and by right development on housing element sites, in October of last year, 2020, the City Council directed staff to discontinue the Affordable Housing Opportunity Program, otherwise known as AHOP, and to instead rezone select housing element sites to the state default density of 30 dwelling units per acre to reach the total 6-cycle RHINA for lower income allocations. Although AHOP was not compatible with the new state laws, HCD guidelines do allow for the default density requirement to be accommodated through an affordable housing additive or overlay zone that allows property owners flexibility to build multifamily housing on their property without modifying the standards of the underlying zoning district or restricting the property owner's existing development rights. Since the majority of the housing element sites outside of the downtown are zoned commercial or BRP, and based on input from property owners, an affordable housing additive zone that allows 30 dwelling units per acre was determined to be the best option, as property owners could continue their existing use while developing a portion or all of their property with housing. Analysis of the housing element sites also revealed the need for 2 affordable housing additive zones. The state requires the city to rezone specific sites that were in prior housing elements and are proposed in the current housing element to allow by right development, provided that a minimum of 20% of the units are restricted as affordable to lower income households. Specifically, this requirement is applied to non-vacant sites that were included in one prior housing element planning period, or vacant sites that were included in 2 or more consecutive housing element planning periods. The state does not require the same by right provision for new housing element sites. Also, many of the new housing element sites are presently in industrial areas where discretionary oversight would still be necessary to ensure compatibility with surrounding uses. Therefore, 2 affordable housing additive zones are proposed. The first is the Affordable Housing Permitted, or AHP, would overlay the former AHOP sites and will allow by right ministerial approval of multifamily development with affordable housing at the default density. The second zone is the Affordable Housing Discretionary, or AHD, which would accommodate the default density on new affordable housing sites with discretionary review. Both of these zones allow multifamily development on top of the underlying zone, and require a minimum of 20% of units be restricted as affordable to lower-income households. The ordinance references the city's R4 development standards and includes objective design standards and findings. Projects would also be eligible for increased density and concessions under the state density bonus provisions. The primary difference between the two additive zones is that the sites with the AHP zone that meet the affordable housing affordability requirement and the applicable objective standards would be approved ministerial under a new site plan review process, while sites in the AHD additive zones would be reviewed under a special use permit. The new additive zone ordinance is based on the retiring AHOP ordinance, but provides a more robust affordable housing program. Unlike the AHOP program that allows higher density for 100% affordable projects, the new ordinance may be used by market rate developers that include at least 20% of units as affordable to lower income households. Based on developer response to date on the proposed ordinance, the new additive zones are anticipated to result in more housing development than under the AHOP. The AHOP zone ordinance also includes an incentive to encourage 100% affordable projects, specifically with an incentive to allow 10% adjustments to numeric development standards such as setbacks and lot coverage. This provision was carried over from the AHOP ordinance that applied to 100% affordable projects and represents a reasonable incentive. State housing element law does not require the city to provide adjustments to development standards. However, this feature helps to reduce project costs for affordable housing developers, since developers can use the adjustments and reserve density bonus concessions for larger development standards. The state density bonus provides parking reductions and up to 4 concessions or incentives for 100% affordable projects, which can be coupled with the adjustments. Next slide, please. Similar to the amendment to the general plan land use element, Chapter 16 of the Oxnard City Code would be amended to permit 30 dwelling units per acre in business research park and commercial zones on parcels that are identified with the AHP and AHD additive zone on the zoning map. Next slide, please. The density bonus section of the Oxnard Code presently requires the Planning Commission approval on density bonus applications to accommodate by right projects ministerially, and to remove a code inconsistency that presently requires all housing projects seeking density bonus to be reviewed by the Planning Commission, even when the underlying permit only requires director approval, and improve project processing efficiencies. The density bonus section would be amended to allow density bonus permits to be approved by the same approval authority as the underlying development permits. Specifically, density bonus for by right projects would be approved by the Community Development Director, while Planning Commission or City Council would continue to review density bonus as part of the underlying discretionary development permits, such as the special use permit. To accommodate by right development on AHP sites, a new ministerial site plan review process is proposed. The proposed ordinance outlines a process for streamlined and simplified ministerial review. Under the proposed ordinance, the director will be the review authority for the SPR to ensure compliance with objective development and design standards. The site plan review will also be reviewed by the Development Advisory Committee, otherwise known as DAC, for consistency with state and local standards to provide an interagency perspective and coordinate with the goal of streamlining the development and building permit process. Specialists may be brought in from other agencies, such as the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District, to review toxic lists or to provide more expertise. To comply with the state definition of by right, The site plan review process is non-discretionary, which means the public agency must act on a development using fixed standards, and the agency cannot use discretionary judgment. Therefore, the site plan review process does not include public meetings or hearings. However, in response to Planning Commission input, the ordinance includes a provision that site plan review permits will be identified on the city's development project list. Next slide, please. This slide provides a breakdown of the zoning map changes and a view of the city's GIS website link in which individual sites can be selected to see the proposed change. The city will rezone approximately 110 parcels, predominantly by adding the affordable housing additive zone on top of the existing zoning by either rezoning the retiring AHOP to AHP or adding the AHD, and by removing the AHOP overlay off of prior housing element parcels that aren't part of the housing element. 8 parcels that have been developed under AHOP will also be rezoned with the AHP additive zone to retain development options for the parcel under an affordable zone designation. I will now turn the presentation back over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Heather. The city prepared an initial study and mitigated negative declaration on the housing element. Standard mitigation measures were added for biological and paleontological resources. We received 6 comment letters. Input from Fish and Wildlife resulted in the addition of 1 mitigation pertaining to streams and a slight modification to an existing biological mitigation measure, biology mitigation measure. Where necessary, these mitigation measures will be added as a condition of approval to a development project. Comment letters did not change the environmental conclusions. In terms of next steps, by October 15th, as I've indicated, the city will submit the final housing element to HCD for certification, inclusive of errata number 1 changes. Then on October 19th, the second reading of the ordinances that Heather reviewed, there are 5 of them, will occur. On November 20th, the zoning text amendments will be effective, along with the ordinances. You can expect, as part of the fiscal year 2021-22 budget requests, that there will be discussions of staff needs and program funding. And the full extent of the budget needs are not known at this time. We'll be looking at that with the housing department over the next few months. With that, staff's recommendation this evening is to conduct a public hearing, approve the initial study and mitigated negative declaration, and update and replace in its entirety the current 2013 through 2021 housing element, which is Chapter 8 within the 2030 General Plan, with provisions listed under the City of Oxnard's final housing element, inclusive of errata number 1, and text and map changes to the General Plan land use element related to the amendment and adoption of this 2021-2029 housing element. Additionally, staff's recommendation is to approve a resolution approving zoning map amendments to change zoning designations on 106 parcels to be consistent with the final housing element and facilitate construction of housing units as identified in the housing element. A next recommendation is to introduce the following 5 ordinances for first reading by title only, waiving further reading. The first one, an ordinance of the City of Oxnard, of the City Council of the City of Oxnard, repealing the All Affordable Housing Opportunity Program and replacing these regulations with the newly created Affordable Housing Permitted and Affordable Housing Discretionary Added Zone Program. The second ordinance, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oxnard, amending the general commercial zone, permitted and related uses in the Oxnard City Code. A third recommendation, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oxnard, amending the Business and Research Park zone to permitted uses as identified in the Oxnard City Code. Fourth, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oxnard creating a ministerial site plan review process within the Oxnard City Code. The action would then be to direct and finalize the noted revisions in errata number 1 to incorporate the 2021 through 2029 housing element into the 2030 general plan as Chapter 8 of the Goals and Policies document. With that, this concludes staff's presentation.